Ta-da-da-da! Ta-da! Puppy power!
Spoiler alert. I really hate this guy. But I promise my videos that include him won't be filled with constant snide remarks about Scrappy. However, I'm sure there will be an occasional one here and there. I'm only human. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes.
Scooby, Scrappy-Dappy-Doo, Scooby,
Scrappy-Dappy-Doo!
Taking a break from whatever it is they do to enjoy a visit to the malt shop, the gang read in the newspaper that a famous comic book artist was claiming to be haunted by his own creation come to life. As usual, despite nobody asking them, Fred and the rest decide they're going to investigate the matter themselves. Why did the villain risk injury jumping to the roof like this? I get the need to enter through the skylight dramatically to intimidate his victim. This was yet another Who Was This For moment in a Scooby episode where the bad guy does something strictly for the benefit of the audience.
And at 2 minutes before midnight here in Lake City, it's 68 degrees. We're looking at temperatures in the high 80s for tomorrow, and now it's back to the news.
Casey Kasem makes for a surprisingly good radio announcer. I wonder if he ever thought about branching out from his cartoon voice acting.
That noise, where's it coming from?
I believe it means the space kook is coming in for a landing. Jerry Sloan was the creator of a comic book superhero named the Blue Scarab. His assistant, Howard Gruger, was no longer content with being a mere letterer and wanted to branch out with his own comic book. Knowing whatever he did would be eclipsed by Sloan, Gruger dressed up as the Blue Scarab to frighten his boss into retiring the character.
Who's there?
What's wrong, Sloan? Don't you recognize this scarab alarm? After all, you created it.
This episode was written by Mark Evanier, a very prolific and respected writer considered by many to be a wise elder of the comic book industry. It's to be expected that a story he'd write about comic books would include various in-jokes or references. For example, the Blue Scarab is likely an homage to the Blue Beetle, a comic book character that originally appeared in 1939, while Jerry Sloan's first name could be a tip of the hat to Jerry Siegel, one of the co-creators of Superman. I can't help but think that those glasses Sloan wears makes him look quite a bit like Stan Lee back in the day. Just without the greasy porn stash. Gruger first threatened Sloan to quit, then, to ruin the superhero's reputation, proceeded to commit the same crimes detailed in an upcoming comic wherein the superhero unwillingly turns to evil. These included robbing a jewelry store, a bank, and a museum.
For I am the Blue Scarab! Wow, what a hero!
Keep reading, Shaggy. I love how you read the Blue Scarab.
This is not meant to be a moment of Scrappy hate, but just something I noticed in this, the puppy's very first line delivery in his very first official appearance in an episode. Lenny Weinrib, Scrappy's original voice actor, gave the character a distinct babyish way of pronouncing some of his words. The way he says Blue Scarab here, for example. Fortunately, as the series progresses, this affectation is mostly dropped. Scrappy is already annoying enough. Sorry. I know I promised to try not to do that.
Hey guys, listen to this. Noted comic book artist Jerry Sloan claims he is being haunted by his own creation, the Blue Scarab.
It's clear that Sloan did not have a publicist, because who in their right mind would okay a press interview in which it's apparent their star writer was suffering from what most would assume was a mental breakdown?
Oh boy, a real Blue Scarab.
Oh, it must be a publicity stunt, Scrappy.
Yeah? Well, we'll see about that. Come on, Uncle Scooby.
For being the dumb but pretty one, Daphne hit the nail on the head. A PR stunt is seemingly the only rational reason why this story would have been leaked to the newspaper.
If you believe my story, you're the only ones. After all, a comic book character coming to life.
It's pretty unbelievable, all right.
It sounds like Velma isn't buying it either. It's evident the Scooby Gang is just humoring their annoying little tag-along. Gruger's scheme had two elements to it: vanity and larceny. As is often the case with Scooby plots like this, it's difficult to determine the value of the ego-based side of things. If Gruger was successful and managed to replace the Blue Scarab with one of his own creations, it would certainly have the potential to be profitable. But in this sentence, the word potential is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
It's a catastrophe. The Blue Scarab is my #1 seller. And if Sloan doesn't draw him, I'm out millions.
Oh, you wouldn't really fire him, would you?
If Sloan won't draw, I'll have no other choice.
In 1979, the average comic book sold for 40 cents per issue, and the most popular titles back then had sales of over 200,000 units per month. If the Blue Scarab was selling just as well, that would put the gross profits at around $1 million per year. Mr. Hardy's comic book company would indeed be out millions if Sloan stopped producing the book. However, it's almost certain Mr. Hardy would just find a new artist to draw the series, because even if Sloan was the creator of the Blue Scarab, it's doubtful that he owned the rights to the character. Successful creator-owned comics are exceedingly rare, and were pretty much non-existent for the major publishers at the time. In fact, not only would Mr. Hardy not cancel the book and employ another artist, he would probably sue Sloan for breach of contract. It can't even be said that Sloan's fame and talent was what made the book sell so well, because, again at the time, most comic book buyers didn't care who drew their favorite characters. It wasn't until years later that the fandom saw a significant shift toward focusing on the artists and writers rather than the publishers. For Gruger's plan to succeed, not only would Mr. Hardy have to be convinced to allow the Blue Scarab comic to fold, but he'd also have to be convinced to approve a lesser-known art assistant's work. And that work would also have to become successful, which is no guarantee. Landfills are rife with comic book series that never reach the double digits. And even if whatever Gruger created became successful, he still wouldn't own the rights to it. It's unfair, but only the publisher would be the one making a lot of money, while the creator would simply be paid whatever page rate he could negotiate. Spider-Man has made tens of billions of dollars for Marvel and Sony over the years, but Steve Ditko died with a net worth of maybe $1 million. Which is fine, really, because he was kind of an asshole. My point is that unless you own the rights to your character, it won't make you rich. And at the time this episode aired, few, if any, comic book creators actually maintain the rights to their own stuff. I grew up with rotary telephones and never saw one with 11 finger holes. Was this one manufactured for Alabama residents?
He should do nicely for the first loot in the Blue Scarab's crime spree.
Wait a minute. The Blue Scarab was just standing in front of the case and took the jewels that had been inside them. But then he was shown to be no longer in front of the case, and the jewels we just saw him take were still inside. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***.
And the report indicates that the Blue Scarab made off with almost $1 million worth of valuable gems.
The jewelry store displayed $1 million worth of precious stones in a thin, unlocked glass case with only a flimsy front door and an elderly, unarmed security guard between them and any potential robbers? Who owned that store? The same guy who owned the Main Street coin shop? Because the security for both of those places was pathetic.
The Blue Scarab has struck again, this time at the First Midtown Bank where he escaped with...
Unfortunately, Shaggy turned off the radio before we learned how much Gruger stole from the bank. It's not likely to have been a ridiculous amount, however, as the Blue Scarab was consistently seen on foot, which means whatever cash he stole had to have been a manageable amount. It's conceivable that he could have made off with $1 million worth of cash, as it would weigh just a little over 20 pounds if in all $100 bills. That's assuming the bank would have had that many of those bills on hand, which was unlikely. This heist probably involved a mix of denominations, which would indicate that a much smaller amount was stolen. For example, 20 pounds worth of $20 bills would be worth close to $200,000. While whatever cash Gruger stole from the bank was worth however much he stole, just because he had $1 million worth of jewels in his possession doesn't mean that's what he could get for them. It's common for criminals to receive no more than 20% of the value of their stolen goods, so provided he knew a reliable fence with enough cash on hand, Gruger would have been lucky to net $200,000 for the jewels. And the final Blue Scarab robbery was even more difficult to assign a dollar value.
And his next target is the City Museum.
The City Museum? Boy, I hope we're not too late.
Funny, I was just hoping we are.
Considering the Scooby Gang's history with museums, it would probably be better in the long run if they just let the Blue Scarab do what he wants. Or, they could have called the police and told them what was going on. Also, the Mystery Machine came to a stop, but we're still seeing scenery moving outside Fred's window. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***.
There he is! And he's got the famous ruby crown!
You'll never stop the Blue Scarab!
It's impossible to determine the value of the stolen ruby crown, as we're not able to see it with enough clarity, though it should be noted that at no point do any rubies seem visible. Daphne refers to it as the famous ruby crown, but that means nothing to us. Perhaps in this section of the Scooby-Doo-niverse, what the Blue Scarab stole had significant historical value, which could place its worth in the multiple millions. But again, the worth of any stolen historical relic is only determined by what an unscrupulous buyer would pay for it. While the larceny side of Gruger's scheme should be much easier to assign a dollar value, we never get enough information to come up with a reliable estimate. However, just going by the one theft for which we did hear an actual figure, the $1 million worth of stolen jewels, and if they sold at the usual 20% rate for fenced goods, Gruger would have made around $200,000, or roughly $1 million in today's money. Thus, the scheme was valuable, but not retire to a tropical paradise valuable. It was also dangerous both for Gruger's health as well as his freedom. Swinging around the outside of buildings is never a good idea, putting him one slip away from a deadly fall. He also robbed places with some level of security, particularly the jewelry store and bank, though since we never saw the latter happen, we can only assume that the bank had some sort of security. Gruger also made his escapes on foot, which severely limited the speed by which he could put a safe distance between himself and his pursuers. Not to mention his outfit was also likely to draw the attention of witnesses, and despite the crimes being committed at night, it was still a big city, so there would have been a lot of them. Without plot armor, the police should have had a very easy time catching him. Much of the value of this scheme was speculative, and relied far too much on matters entirely out of Gruger's hands. And the only thing that would bring him immediate tangible profit was dangerous to his personal safety, and not worth the risk of getting caught. He gets a 2 out of 5 for the design. This is the first time that a superhero turned supervillain made an appearance in the franchise, so it's already off to a good start. Despite some other questionable additions to the Scooby formula introduced in the series, at least the first episode began with an original idea, so kudos to the producers for that.
Oh boy, it's the Blue Scarab alarm!
Like it's the Blue Scarab himself!
Setting aside how the windows opened before the Blue Scarab reached them, he just casually swung inside using a rope. Gruger was 6 stories up and unlikely to survive if his hand slipped. The dude was not a mountain climber. Though admittedly for an artist, he was rather ripped.
I have returned!
The Blue Scarab was already there. What's with the flash of light? Did the animators toss that in, thinking it was the usual magical appearance, like when a witch or wizard arrives unexpectedly, forgetting that the villain had already swung in by rope? Or was this Gruger's attempt to intimidate his victims even more with a flashy light show? The originality of the villain is not the only feature deserving of praise. The Blue Scarab costume was filled with special effects, including smoke and flashing lights, as well as the suit's ability to repel attackers with electric shocks.
But I didn't know you were going to be giving me electric shocks.
My Uncle Scooby is going to be so proud of me when I catch the Blue Scarab. Here comes the Blue Scarab now. Why will he be surprised? Wow!
Scrappy took great care in hiding the trap's net with a pile of leaves, which are no longer there when Scooby trips it. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***.
Who are you? You don't know. You've only drawn those infernal comic books about me for 10 years.
While wearing the mask, Gruger's voice also took on an intimidating echo effect, which was a nice attention to detail. It does make me wonder if perhaps the producers were influenced by another famous bad guy introduced in the late 1970s who also had an electronically distorted voice. Unfortunately, while physically imposing, the Blue Scarab design wasn't frightening, which stands to reason as he was designed to be a superhero that appealed to kids. Granted, there were spooky comic book superheroes before this episode aired, but this wasn't yet the 1980s, so the idea of a ghoulish good guy wasn't quite as established. I won't fault the outfit for not being scary in and of itself, because for this plot, it wouldn't be appropriate. From a mystery standpoint, however, Gruger dropped the ball almost as much as a certain stuntman did. Of all the suspects seen in the episode, only Gruger had the physique to not only convincingly wear the Blue Scarab disguise, but also the required physical strength and stamina needed to scale buildings and swing from ropes.
He just padded his suit and loaded it with gimmicks that you created in your comic.
Despite what Fred said, it's clear that Gruger did not need to pad his suit. The guy was ripped. You'd think Mr. Bench Press 220 would have noticed. If I had to pick any one major complaint about this villain costume, it would be that it wasn't that memorable. The Blue Scarab looked for all the world like a cheap Batman knockoff, but with the edges filed down so as not to upset any children in the audience. The Blue Scarab was the rounded kindergarten scissors of comic book superheroes. Despite the unforgivable sin of being utterly forgettable, this villain was at least original, and even though not that scary, it didn't need to be under the circumstances. It was also overflowing with special effects. The Blue Scarab gets an outfit score of 4 out of 5. Gruger was very careless when it came to keeping his identity as the Blue Scarab secret. It wouldn't take a genius to figure out who the villain was, considering all the hints he dropped.
After the Blue Scarab vanished, I found this on my wall.
That's the sign of the scarab!
That is a hell of a lot of detail just for a superhero leaving his mark. All the shadows make it appear as though it's a hanging decoration when it's supposed to be a simple drawing on the wall. About the only way this could have been any more overly complicated was if he had lugged a bunch of gasoline to the top of a bridge to leave a flaming logo.
You see, whoever it was also a good artist, as we could tell by the quality of the scarab he painted on the wall.
Not only was the Blue Scarab mark on the wall very detailed and would have taken a real artist to paint, but it would also have taken a while to do so. Meaning whoever did it needed to have uninterrupted access to Sloan's studio for a significant length of time. It's not something Gruger could have knocked up during the 2 minutes in which he had accosted his boss at the beginning of the episode. This was yet another obvious clue that the art assistant was behind the mask.
The Blue Scarab will turn to crime and ruin forever his name and yours.
It's a good thing for Gruger that Scooby was holding Scrappy, considering where Scrappy's punches were otherwise going to land.
Oomph! What'd you expect? I'm just a little puppy.
Not that he didn't hit that area later on.
We had several clues, Mr. Sloan. Because of the crimes, whoever was pretending to be the Blue Scarab had to have read the unpublished comic.
I cannot fathom why Gruger decided to commit the same robberies as detailed in the unpublished comic. This was completely unnecessary for the purpose of his scheme. If his goal was to discredit the character of the Blue Scarab and turn public opinion against it, any crime would have sufficed. He could have vandalized a park, set fire to a school, or even given a Nazi salute while in front of a large crowd. By specifically focusing on the crimes mentioned in the comic book that only a handful of people have read, just reduced the suspect pool to 2 people, and with only one of them in good enough shape to climb buildings.
Go get him now, Uncle Scoob! Puppy power! You can't get away from Scrappy-Doo, I tell you!
And the Blue Scarab was just here, and he escaped down that hole.
Well, he didn't go by me.
And we sure didn't see him.
Worst of all, Gruger managed to get caught by Scrappy-Doo of all people. There wasn't anywhere he could have run between the time Scrappy started chasing him and when Fred and the girls arrived. The storage room had no windows to escape through, and there didn't appear to be any other exits. He would have had barely enough time to ditch the costume and hide it behind a box, and that's only if he was wearing his street clothes under his disguise. A part of me suspects Fred and Velma already knew Gruger was the bad guy, but didn't want to disappoint Scrappy by solving the mystery too soon. Though I'm not sure delaying his capture was a good idea, all things considered.
Okay now, Scrappy. We want you to stay here for your own safety.
Sure, Uncle Scooby. Don't move. I got it.
Look! Scrappy!
I'm not moving. I'm not moving.
Scrappy!
Just kidding. But this was an attempted murder on the part of Gruger. Setting aside whether the law in the Scooby-Doo universe would count killing a talking dog as murder, he did start prying loose the grotesque when Daphne was still in the line of fire.
You could see the whole press room from up here.
Good idea, Scrappy. Maybe we can spot him before he spots us. Zoinks! Like we're moving! Scooby, look!
This was yet another attempted murder. Also, what the hell's going on with Shaggy's arms? Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***. Gruger certainly felt his scheme was important enough that he was willing to kill for it, so he does get high marks for that. However, these attempts were unnecessary if he had only given his plan a little more thought and revised some elements of it.
Have you decided to retire, or do you need further convincing?
Instead of appearing before Sloane when he was surrounded by witnesses, Gruger should have focused solely on gaslighting his boss into thinking he was being haunted. This would have resulted in either Sloane quitting voluntarily or being hospitalized with a mental breakdown. Gruger was not under any deadlines to ruin Sloane's career and could have taken his time and spread out his Blue Scarab appearances over weeks or even months. Perhaps that was Gruger's original plan, but after the gang arrived, he panicked and decided only at that moment to commit the real-life robberies dressed as the Blue Scarab. One might think that Gruger, having painted the symbol on the wall, meant he always intended for others to know that the Blue Scarab's appearances weren't just in Sloane's mind. However, most would likely assume that Sloane had painted the symbol himself, either as a lie to bolster his claims of being haunted, or while in a fugue state while suffering his delusions. In any case, it would have been a lot wiser for Gruger to have only used a temporary symbol for the wall so he could remove it before anyone else other than Sloane had seen it, further driving the man to doubt his own senses, or simply refrain from painting the symbol at all. His boss looked plenty disturbed already just by seeing the Blue Scarab in the first place. Remember how I said how odd it was that Sloane's claims of being haunted by the Blue Scarab had been mentioned in the newspaper? Perhaps this had been leaked to the press by Gruger in a further attempt to get Sloane to lose his job. No company wants the negative publicity surrounding one of their star employees seemingly going insane, so there was a chance that Mr. Hardy would fire Sloane or even cancel the Blue Scarab comic book rather than deal with any public fallout. Please understand that I'm not saying anyone suffering a mental health crisis should be publicly shamed or lose their job. But it's common for businesses not to care about the suffering of those working for them and routinely take heartless actions to protect their brand.
I'll bet this is the Scarab's secret hiding place.
I've often said how terrible the gang are at being responsible dog owners since they wouldn't put a leash on Scooby, allowing him to get into all sorts of trouble. Going forward, I think that's going to go double for Scrappy.
This is no time to be reading comic books, Uncle Scooby.
Huh? Did you find the Blue Scarab?
No, they found my comic book collection.
Sloane is a terrible comic book collector, leaving his issues in loose stacks like that and not bagged and boarded. Then again, this could be his working library of back issues for research or even reference drawings. Or actual drawings if he subscribes to the Greg Land School of Comic Book Illustration.
Like I haven't seen this one before. Blue Scarab... Super Crook? Blue Scarab Super Crook?
That's next month's issue. It's not on the stands yet.
Wait a minute. What does that issue say? Poopta Tales. If this is an innocent reference to a real comic book somewhere, I don't know what it is. But all I can say is that image almost looks like a pair of legs and buttocks with a yellowish fluid squirting out of it. That can't be the case, right? I mean, by itself, the image is mostly innocent, but with the word poop in the title, I'm not insane by having my mind go there, right?
A good idea, Fred, old buddy. Like, we'll just stay here and catch up on our reading. Cleaning. We'll clean up this mess, all right, Fred?
From the way Scooby turned that page, they're starting from the back of the comic and reading to the front. That's not manga. Gruger missed an opportunity to safely dispose of his rival, and made several errors in judgment that led directly to his capture. However, he also had the tenacity to try and gruesomely rid himself of a group of meddling kids, which counts for a lot in my book. He gets a 3 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the fake blue scarab with a final due score of 3 out of 5.
Splat him, Uncle Scooby!
Because of the crimes, whoever was pretending to be the Blue Scarab had to have read the unpublished comic.
Wait a minute. Gruger was captured in the press room and was a suspect in several major robberies. Wouldn't the cops have immediately taken him to the police station? Why did they take him to Sloan's studio for the unmasking?
I can still help with one of my ingenious Scrappy traps.
For a brief moment, as the scene fades out, you can see it was going to switch to the gang on the rooftop after their elevator ride. But the editor must have realized they put the scenes in the wrong order and quickly cut to the gang running toward the elevators. But they didn't trim the scene correctly and left in these few frames during the transition. Also, the rooftop access went from 2 elevator shafts to a single door leading to a stairway. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Melnick Suzuki. Thank you, Melnick Suzuki. Kyler Hare. Thank you, Kyler Hare. Kirsten Petaway. Thank you, Kirsten Petaway. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal shout out in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. Oh, before I go, I just wanted to share this photo of longtime Patreon supporter Lane Lindonsky wearing the Carl the Stuntman shirt available on my channel's YouTube merch store. The store has been activated, but I'm still trying to figure out how to get it to show properly for everyone. I sent a direct link to my paid channel supporters, and as a thank you to them, it's currently set at a 0 profit margin for the month of February. This means anyone who buys now essentially gets their stuff at the lowest price I can set. Because I don't really know what I'm doing, it's more than likely anyone can see the merch store link somewhere on my channel. So if you want to buy anything there, this is the time to get the best deal. However, if you want to help support my channel financially, I'll be setting the profit margin back to normal on March 1st. If you send me a photo wearing or holding any of my merch, I'd be thrilled to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. The gang visit an amusement park where guests live out their fantasies with the help of lifelike robots. Having always wanted to solve a mystery with the legendary Sherlock Holmes, Velma would become his android version's temporary Dr. Watson as they search for the crown jewels of England, recently stolen from the Tower of London. Unfortunately, a malfunctioning electronic bad guy threatens to turn the safety of the make-believe into real-life danger.
Welcome to Wonder World, where your fantasies become reality. You must be Velma. I know your fantasy.
3 days? Like that's a long time to be cooped up with a bunch of robots.
And there's no way out until your time is up.
Apparently, fire exits are also just a fantasy at Wonder World. I've been doing my Scooby Villain ranking videos for almost 2 years now, during which I've completely covered 3 separate series and several direct-to-video films. The Night Ghoul of Wonderworld is easily the most confusing episode I've come across. It's no exaggeration to say I spent the longest amount of time working on this section of my script after having to constantly rewrite what the bad guy's scheme was and how it unfolded. I've done my best to unravel things, so please cut me some slack for any mistakes you might find, because making sense of this episode was like eating soup with a fork. After repeated viewings and carefully examining the dialogue, here's what I think was the writer's intent. Mr. Marino was the host of Wonderworld, a high-tech amusement park wherein animatronic robots interacted with visitors to create realistic depictions of fantasy situations. Indeed, calling them animatronic doesn't do them justice because they seem to be practically real, with a degree of autonomy that makes Charlie the robot look like a wind-up toy.
A toy robot!
As easy as it would be to devote a lot of time discussing just the robots of Wonderworld and how ridiculously advanced they were for the time, I've already gone down that route in other videos, so we'll just take it for granted that this technology exists in this section of the Scooby-Doo-niverse. At some point prior to the gang visiting the park, Marino stole the real crown jewels from the real Tower of London. He then hid them in plain sight at the fake Tower of London located in Wonderworld. Unfortunately for him, the computer that controlled the guest scenarios decided that Velma's Sherlock Holmes fantasy would involve solving the disappearance of what should have been a replica of the crown jewels. Without Marino's knowledge, Wonderworld's computer had one of its robot bad guys, the Night Ghoul of London, steal the fake crown jewels, in reality the real ones, and hide them. For whatever reason, the host of Wonderworld lacked the necessary permission to ask the computer directly for the hiding spot's location, so he had to allow Velma and Holmes to locate them, which should have put an end to the mystery.
This way, Scoob! Stop, I'll get you!
Unfortunately for Marino, prior to Velma doing so, Shaggy and Scooby had inadvertently damaged the Night Ghoul robot, and instead of allowing the scenario to end, it malfunctioned and again made off with the crown jewels. This time while trying to physically harm the gang, which would otherwise have been against its programming.
I must apologize for his malfunction, Velma. He'll have to go back to the shop. You may leave right away if you wish.
We're not leaving, because I haven't solved the mystery. The crown jewels are still missing, and I intend to find them.
The Night Ghoul had managed to hide the crown jewels again before the gang could stop its rampage, and Marino was dismayed to learn Velma was determined to remain in Wonderland to find them. Desperate to stop the teenagers from succeeding, he dressed up as the Night Ghoul to try and frighten them away from the park so he could find the jewels himself. The setting of this episode combined both a popular movie and TV show that aired just before and during the time of production. The idea of a high-tech amusement park manned by humanoid robots was a direct reference to the film Westworld, while the idea of a resort bringing the dreams of their guests to life was straight out of the Fantasy Island TV series. Most watching this video have likely at least heard of Westworld, considering the recent TV show, but some might be unaware that the series was based on a film originally released in 1973, written and directed by famous author and climate change denier Michael Crichton. Much like his later massive hit Jurassic Park, Westworld explored the theme of high-tech resort attractions running amok and killing guests. Fantasy Island, a TV series that originally ran from 1977 to 1984 and also suffered a remake or two, similarly explored the idea of creating a fake world for visitors to live out their wishes. Though as opposed to the technology used in Westworld, it is heavily implied that the fantasies on Fantasy Island were engineered via supernatural means by its host, the enigmatic Mr. Rourke, played by Ricardo Montalban. Marino, with his white suit and Latino accent, was obviously modeled after that character. In Westworld, a computer glitch caused the robots to malfunction, deactivating safety protocols that would otherwise prevent them from harming guests. Whereas in Fantasy Island, the unintended consequences of a visitor's fantasy were what usually drove the conflict in the story.
I'm an antique collector who always dreamed of visiting Victorian London. How's my chance?
Ah yes, Victorian London. That wonderful time of child labor, tuberculosis, and the Great Stink, when the River Thames was so clogged with raw sewage that the smell alone was bad enough to disrupt Parliament. Much like how the amusement park in Westworld was divided into 3 sections, Westworld, Medieval World, and Roman World, Wonderworld here consisted of Outlaw World, based on the Old West, Prehistoric World, set during the Age of Dinosaurs, and London World, set in that city during the Victorian era. Though we only get glances of the first 2 areas, it's hard not to imagine it would have been a much more entertaining Scooby episode if the gang had stopped at either of those locations instead. Westworld and Fantasy Island weren't the only influences in this episode. It's obvious the green monster robot scene here is a reference to The Incredible Hulk, which at the time was airing on CBS, and the dinosaur looks very similar to Godzuki, a character featured in Hanna-Barbera's own Godzilla cartoon airing on NBC immediately following Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo on ABC. The episode begins with the Night Ghoul stealing the crown jewels from the Tower of London. This is where it already starts to get confusing because it's unclear whether this scene took place in the real world or Wonderworld.
Suddenly the lights failed, and when they come back on, the jewels were gone. Were you standing guard outside the room at the time? Yes, no one came in and no one left.
Was there a guard in the room as well?
Of course.
The guard shown during the opening scene had brown hair and looked identical to the one that Velma spoke to later. Except he claimed he was outside the room at the time the crown jewels were taken, and it had been another guard who was in the room at the time. Except that guard didn't look anything at all like the one at the beginning. So did the opening scene occur at the actual Tower of London when the real crown jewels were stolen while being guarded by a real human being, and when Velma was discussing this with that guard later, he was actually just a robot giving details of the crime to guests as per his programming? And by coincidence, the robot guard just happened to look like the real human guard at the tower. Whatever version of the Tower of London seen at the beginning is identical to what we know is the fake Tower of London seen later. But that doesn't mean anything, as the Wonderworld location could have been a very convincing recreation of the real-life inspiration.
Wait a minute. I've got it!
Amazing! The crown jewels were there all along.
A criminal hid the jewels where no one would think to look, in plain sight at Wonderworld.
If the crime at the beginning of the episode was the real one, was that Marino dressed as the Night Ghoul? Or was the thief someone we never saw in the episode, and Marino only found out later that the jewels in the fake Tower of London were real, and he decided to take them for himself? At no point was Marino directly identified as the one who originally stole the crown jewels. Apart from the guard discrepancy, it would also make sense for the opening scene having shown the actual theft of the real crown jewels, because the Wonderworld robots had no reason to go through the hassle of acting out the robbery. There were presumably no guests watching during the event, so all that mattered was for the jewels to be moved from the display case to the hidden one below. It didn't matter who actually did that. In fact, it would have been more efficient for the robot guarding the room to move them himself and simply lie about being attacked by the Night Ghoul should any guests ask for details. If this was indeed Marino's scheme, it was plagued with issues. Most notably the fact that the notoriety of what he stole would severely limit how he could profit from them. As mentioned not long ago, relics with significant historical value can be worth a lot of money due to their background. Few collections are worth more than the crown jewels of England, with their modern estimated worth of several $billion. Even ignoring that they are always under massive security and the idea that Marino could have so easily made off with them, there are very few buyers in the world willing to not only pay even a tenth of their worth, but also assume the monumental risk of being caught with them in their possession. If he exists in this iteration of the Scooby-Doo universe, perhaps the Sultan of Swahili would be interested, as he did have a history of trying to get hold of historical items others didn't want to sell to him. This is assuming, of course, that the goal was selling the crown jewels. Marino may have wanted to simply hold them for ransom, which might have been an easier way to profit, but definitely a lot less safe. Selling to an unscrupulous billionaire should at least guarantee the buyer had no incentive to rat out the original thief, whereas the government of the United Kingdom had no reason to adhere to any agreement made with the criminal once they regained their lost treasure. Marino's motive for the crime is baffling, made even more so by it not being known exactly what his position was at Wonderworld. In Fantasy Island, the host, Mr. Rourke, was implied to be the owner and chief architect of all the supernatural shenanigans. If Mr. Marino was meant to have the same purpose, what would have been his reason for stealing the crown jewels? It's clear he was more than a simple actor hired as a host for the park because he had knowledge to fix and reprogram the robots. He also had unrestricted access to the most sensitive areas, which allowed him to easily hide the crown jewels in the fake Tower of London. In fact, it makes the most sense that he was the sole owner and operator of Wonderworld, because that, in and of itself, would give him a compelling reason for his crime.
Like, who are you?
Allow me to introduce Mr. Alexander Wodehouse, a fellow traveler to London World. We're now passing through prehistoric world. This is Outlaw World.
Wonderworld was massive in scale, easily rivaling Disney World in size, as seen by the long monorail ride the gang took to get to their destination. That much real estate would require millions of dollars annually to maintain, let alone the cost for all the high-tech robots and attractions. Yet apart from the Scooby Gang, we only ever saw one other guest the entire episode. For whatever reason, this incredible Wonderworld seemed to completely bomb as an amusement park. Then again, it could also be one catered to the very wealthy, not only keeping the place from becoming crowded, but again offering circumstantial evidence that the teenagers come from rich families. It's too bad the writers of this episode didn't have the foreknowledge of the Jurassic Park film, or they would have had Velma and the rest invited to the park as consultants before it was open to the public so they could help work out any kinks in the mystery portion of the attraction. If Wonderworld was as vacant as it appeared, Marino would be panicking if he was the owner. Whether he originally stole the crown jewels or came into their possession by happenstance, they must have seemed like a desperate lifeline for the soon-to-be bankrupt host. Usually, if the villain scheme is worth a lot of money, the risk involved is considered less important in terms of the points I award, particularly if the bad guy was in dire financial straits. However, in this situation, I just cannot see any future that would not end with Marino behind bars. He gets a design score of 1 out of 5. This section is going to be short, because there really wasn't much to the Night Ghoul disguise.
221B Baker Street, where the most baffling mysteries in the world have been solved.
Precisely, and our current case is perhaps the most puzzling of all.
On the one hand, I want to give the animators props for attention to detail, insofar as they included a violin in Holmes' sitting room, considering he famously played a Stradivarius. On the other hand, they drew the holes in the body backwards.
Who do you suspect?
The most fearsome criminal ever to prowl these foggy streets, the Night Ghoul of London.
Despite looking the way he does, the Night Ghoul isn't a monster or a zombie or any other supernatural creature. He's just a guy referred to by Sherlock Holmes as a fearsome criminal. I guess he's just ugly. And Sherlock Holmes is kind of a dick. Regardless if Marino dressed up as the Night Ghoul when he originally stole the crown jewels, he did use this as his disguise at one point. So let's look at it as we would any other costume. It's not an original design, because it looks for all the world like yet another villain inspired by Mr. Hyde or the man in the beaver hat from London After Midnight. There are no special effects, unless you count being able to shoot sparks out of your chest or split manhole covers in half with your bare hands. But of course, neither of those count because they were the actions of the robot Night Ghoul and not Marino when he was in disguise. It's even debatable whether the costume was scary because, in the end, the Night Ghoul was just a wrinkly old man. I suppose that could frighten some people, but really, that's just being ageist, and shame on them for that. Marino does get a tiny bit of credit for improvising, as he likely didn't have much of a choice when it came to his disguise. He was practically forced to wear one after Velma made it clear she and the rest weren't leaving after stopping the robot Night Ghoul. That's only worth half a point to me, leaving him with an outfit score of 1.5 out of 5. Disregarding the original theft of the crown jewels, which we may or may not have seen, Marino made the second critical mistake any Scooby villain could make just after kidnapping. He didn't make the gang leave the scene of the crime when he had the power to do so. Whether or not he owned Wonderworld, Marino was still a highly placed employee and doubtless had the authority to eject guests from the park. He didn't even have to lie or come up with a plausible excuse. The malfunctioning robots were an obvious danger to visitors, and clearing out Wonderworld of non-essential personnel was a no-brainer.
But I'd better give Sherlock a quick check to make sure he's still working properly. Seems to be working fine. Well, I wish you good luck.
Then he pretended to examine Holmes, but really short-circuited him, so he'd be of no use as a detective.
Keeping with the theme of malfunctioning robots, in order to hinder the gang's attempts at finding the crown jewels, Marino decided to prevent them from getting any helpful advice from the Sherlock Holmes robot by using sabotage.
Sabotage? How? When?
Instead of messing around with Holmes' wiring, why didn't Marino simply deactivate the robot completely? All he had to do was say he was doing it for the safety of the gang, because if the night ghoul malfunctioned and attempted to harm them, the Holmes robot might also do the same. This would have been much less suspicious on his part. That counts as attempted murder. Falling chandeliers are no joke. Usually.
But what about Velma's fantasy? Well, that's handled entirely by our computer, which will keep it a secret even from me. Naturally, since it took you such a short time to solve the crown jewel mystery, you'll all receive a refund for the extra days.
Remember, no one was supposed to know what mystery the computer picked. Mr. Marino.
This was presented as some sort of gotcha moment by Velma, but it doesn't stand up. Sure, at the beginning, the computer might have kept the scenario secret from everyone, even Marino, but the gang had been inside London World looking for the crown jewels long enough that the host would probably be aware of at least some parts of the fantasy by then, even if he didn't know the solution. The episode counts this as a mistake by Marino, but I won't. It does track that the computer locked Marino out of the details of the story, because if he was able to interrogate the computer, he could have simply asked it where the night ghoul had hidden the crown jewels and picked them up before Velma and the rest did. If for nothing else but safety reasons, surely Marino had the authority to overrule the computer's programming for secrecy.
Don't call me Shirley.
These fish and chips are sure authentic. They're even served in newspapers.
Like all the fish that's fit to print, huh?
Another article about the missing crown jewels. There's something strange about this. The article describes the same crime, but there's a TV antenna in the picture. Since there isn't one at the London World Tower, it had to be the real Tower of London.
The two newspapers Velma had were supposed to have been literally the same one that had been used to wrap Shaggy's fish and chips, but they're not even close. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***. For a theme park built to recreate Victorian London as accurately as possible, it was a massive oversight on the staff's part to use outside newspapers to wrap their fish and chips. But it might have been even worse than that. Every source I could find said that the English didn't start wrapping fish and chips in newspapers until World War II, when paper was rationed and they needed a substitute wrapper. So not only was it an error on the part of Marino to allow outside newspapers into the park, but even choosing that method at all to wrap food was probably a mistake. It should be noted that at no point in the episode are we told where on Earth Wonderworld was located, but it's easy to infer from several clues that it had to be somewhere in the United Kingdom. The use of the aforementioned outside newspapers is clue number one. If Wonderworld had been in, say, Manhattan, those fish and chips would have been wrapped in the New York Post. Or maybe not, because that paper would have made the food taste like shit. Another clue is the fact that Wonderworld was even used as a place to stash the crown jewels after the theft. It would have been very difficult to smuggle them out of the country or even the city so quickly after the robbery, so the park had to be reasonably close to the Tower of London. Finally, at the end of the episode, it was Scotland Yard who arrived to take possession of the crown jewels and arrest Marino. No matter where on the planet Wonderworld was located, the first authorities who would arrive on the scene would be from whatever jurisdiction was closest. Certainly, Scotland Yard would eventually be contacted, but it would take a while for one of their representatives to fly from England to wherever else in the world hosted the park. I'm focusing on the location of Wonderworld because there is something that bugs the hell out of me about this episode. In particular, the twist reveal that the stolen crown jewels in Velma's mystery were in fact the real crown jewels of England. The theft of the crown jewels would have been front-page news all over the world, let alone in the United Kingdom. You could go nowhere in the country without someone mentioning the crime. It should have been impossible for the gang to not be aware they were stolen by the time they got to Wonderworld. This would have been an easy fix for the writers. All they needed to do was show the real crime at the beginning of the episode, and when Velma arrived for her mystery vacation, Marino could have said that they were inspired by the real-life crime and thus tailored her story accordingly. Then, during the course of the episode, the fake jewels could have been accidentally swapped with the real ones, and the rest of the story could have played out as seen. It's also weird that only one officer from Scotland Yard arrived to arrest Marino and recover the crown jewels. For a crime as notorious as this, Wonderworld should have been swarming with fuzz.
Here come the fuzz.
Then again, the fact that Scotland Yard saw fit to assign a single officer to such an important task might be indicative of a general lack of care by British authorities at the time, which might explain why Marino was able to successfully steal the crown jewels in the first place. Regardless if the theft we saw at the beginning was the real deal or a mere recreation, there's only one guy armed with a pike next to an empty suit of armor in a room with an open window. Under those circumstances, even Francis from Pee-wee's Big Adventure could have stolen them without even having to hire a thug. Perhaps the biggest mistake made by Marino was choosing to hide the crown jewels where he worked. Sure, there's a certain flair in the audacity needed to pull off such a stunt, but as we saw from the episode, he would have been better off renting a storage locker somewhere under an assumed name. Or was Marino simply the bagman for the robbery, and the real thief only brought him into the deal for the sole purpose of hiding the crown jewels in the fake Tower of London? This would have made a lot more sense than Marino himself having been the one to steal them. It would usually take a criminal syndicate with a lot of resources to pull off such a huge heist, so perhaps they were the silent backers of Wonderworld. Or did they have blackmail material on Marino? When he was so desperate to get the crown jewels back, maybe he wasn't worried about selling them, but rather he didn't want an embarrassing secret of his to be exposed. Finally, what would have been the harm in having the gang find the real crown jewels? Marino didn't know where they were after the Night Ghouls stole them the second time. He should have welcomed Velma's help, and once they were found, he could simply go on pretending they were fake and had one of the other robots take them back to the display case at the fake Tower of London. Of course, by then, Velma had already seen the real newspaper that clued her in as to what was going on, but Marino didn't know that yet. Apart from possibly stealing the crown jewels, Marino didn't really do much in this episode. The majority of the time the Night Ghoul was on screen, it was a robot acting under its programming to further the mystery Velma had requested. The Wonderworld host didn't actively engage menacingly with the gang until almost near the end, when he had a single chase with Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy, and was almost immediately caught thereafter. Somehow, Marino did manage to get hold of the crown jewels, so there's always that. But everything else he did ended in abject failure. He gets a 2 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the Night Ghoul of London with a final due score of 1.5 out of 5.
Of course, but it was too dark for him to see anything.
Well, there's nothing in there.
Scrappy really needs to be kept on a leash. Worst dog owners ever. What the hell? There's no way that Scooby could have put the robot horse together like that. It was the right half that fell, yet the first 2 times he tried putting it back together, he was clearly holding an identical left half before it magically turned into the right half. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***. And that's my ranking of the villains from the first set of episodes of the first season of Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, shown here. Well, we're not exactly off to a great start. The Blue Scarab was decent and held up rather well when compared to past Scooby villains, but the Night Ghoul gave a certain balding monkey man a run for his money at being the worst ever. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout-out in the next regular video.